You're
There we
recording
go.
again?
Okay. Thank you very much. I'm sorry. I did everything I could on here. Uh, Good. Here's what we have. I could always have a review session on Sunday morning.
Yeah,
Turkey and
we were all talking
Afghanistan.
about meeting together and working the case study.
Yeah, sure. Turkey and Afghanistan, basically neutral and independent uh, during the war. We went into that in some detail. Iran is unable to remain neutral. And so what happens is the British protect Arabia, Yemen, and Oman. And that's the issue that we have today because you have Yemen, who is tied very heavily to Iran as a surrogate. Arabia, um, the king and the crown prince don't like that because they shoot missiles over Riyadh, they tear up into the oil fields and their refinery plants that are there. And then Oman sits a little bit to the east of where Yemen is. They're still part of the what we call the peninsula or the Arabian Peninsula, and so the Saudis are there. So when the war breaks out, and then after the war, Britain begins to protect Arabia, Yemen, and Oman, and that's generally what we have here. So Egypt and Libya, however, are actively engaged in fighting the war. One reason is that they want support from the British after the war. They want support from the United States after the war, and they want to protect the canal. They don't want the canal to fall into any other turmoil that's there. And so here's a key part of it. I'll go for a few minutes afterwards if you can stay. I'll try to catch up with this part of it here for you. After the war, it's the birth of what we call the Arab League. And that's what we're seeing coming out of it. There's a league of Arab areas. You don't call them Arab states, but there's a large population of Arabs in different areas of the Middle East based on where they were under the Ottomans. And what they want is, after the war, they want to organize themselves together. It's sort of this, federation of Arab states, and that's what they were opposed to the creation of any new states because it would impact their idea of trying to move forward and create a confederation of Arab states. That was their goal. Okay, and so what follows then, just as I gave you the overview last week, I gave you that model. Here you can see it now. What follows are revolutionary governments because individuals in those areas that don't want to be part of an Arab League. Some want independence. Some are warming toward the Soviets. Some are warming toward the British. Some are warming to us. It's all over the place. And so now what's going to be established in the Middle East are a series of revolutionary governments. Coming near the end of the late in the 1970s, it's the last big one, which is the Iranian revolutionary government coming out of all of this turmoil. Now remember, Iran is not part of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman areas are going to go through multiple revolutions. So you're going to see them in Egypt, you'll see them in Libya, you're going to see them in Iraq. They're still going on. So what follows then, when the war ends, are a series of these revolutionary governments. Uh, uh, Small industries from the supply center continue, okay, and they produce in the Middle East what is called urbanization. So I didn't give you that part of it last time about the supply center. So not all of it deteriorates. Uh, the cooperation does, but the industries in different parts of the Middle East that were all part of the supply center, they continue. And what they're going to produce is urbanization. What's that? Well, you know what urbanization is, cities and things like that. People that have moved from the rural areas into the cities to work in the supply center, and they had jobs, and these small industries are going to continue. Decide, let's stay in the cities and let's not go back to the rural areas. So just as in our country, people are attracted from rural areas to cities because there's jobs and opportunities there. Now you're going to see the growth of Middle Eastern cities after the war. There wasn't a whole lot of that growth before the war because the people who lived in cities, they were there. People who lived in the rural areas, in the countryside, they were there with their tribal areas. So now we're going to see a different pattern emerge here that's going to have an effect on how these people want to be governed. and what kind of system they want. Okay, and so we know that when the war ends, Britain and France are exhausted. They started fighting in 1939. It's 1945. They've got a lot of losses. They've got a lot of debt. There's a lot of cleanup throughout Europe that has to be done. They've got to figure out how to get back on their feet, how to get all this trading going. It's going to be a Herculean effort. So therefore, they don't have the ability to do what they did in the past in the Middle East. Results, they began to withdraw from the Middle East. And all those Middle Eastern countries that supported them during the war and had the supply center, and you're going to do this when the war ends. Remember, we wanted it in 37, we wanted it in 39. They're going to leave. Yeah. They're leaving. They have to leave. They're destitute. They can't handle it. They got to borrow money from us. They've been fighting 39. And so what happens? The Soviets and the U.S. come in. That's right. Unlike the British and French, that generally work together most of the time, but they still sparred with each other, and you'll see it in the Suez Crisis. The United States and the Soviets don't. Once the war ends, we're on two different paths, parallel lines, and they're not going to cross. Our interests are different, their interests are different. Their ideological interests from the Soviets, okay? So, both powers began to exert political, economic, and military influence. All right, what's left out? Nothing culturally, nope. Political, economic, military, nothing socially, right? So they're worried about politics and the economy, and we got military power. And so what's going to happen in the Middle East after World War II? They're going to get involved in political, economic, and military matters, opposed to religious items aren't mentioned here. Cultural, not mentioned here. Nope. Social, not mentioned here. So you can see where they're going. What follows then is a Cold War in not only Europe, but a Cold War in the Middle East that begins. All right. And so you see Iraq, 1939 Prime Minister Nuri al-Sayed. Okay. He breaks from Germany. And then in 1940, we have Rashid Ali becomes prime minister. This is to give you an example to get us caught up as to what's happening here with Iraq. And he moves against the British. And what happens is April 1st, 1941, they stage a coup against the existing government. All right, you can see this. This leads up to the revolutionary issues. British learn of it, and they begin to land Indian troops at Basra. And when the war ends, these British troops are all the way up to Mosul. So now Britain's getting really into the area of Iraq. All right. Okay. They get close to Baghdad. Okay. Arab League and Transjordan also help the British because they want things from the British after the war. Right. Okay. Al-Rashid and his supporters flee to Turkey and Iran. Right. Because the British are coming. Because they weren't supposed to help the Germans, and they did, right? And so Nuri al-Sayed returns as prime minister. And the British don't like that, but they're going to control the Iraqi government. And so now what happens is this is all during the war. When this breaks down, they're going to leave, and then there are going to be problems that will take place. The nationalist leader, Rashid, are found and executed. We're almost there. Hang on. Just a few minutes here. And so Nuri begins to promote Arab unity. Same thing they wanted before. They wanted an Arab League, Arab unity. This goes back deep into the history of what happened in the Arabian Peninsula. Right? This is what they're after. Okay? And so in 1943, Iraq then declares war on Germany. That's what the British wanted. Why? Earlier slide talks about it. The British are going to give them, and they're going to help support this Arab idea of unity. As long as you're with us, Arab unity, okay, when the war's over, fine. It's always on the come, and when the war's over, Britain and France are going to leave. Okay? 1943 to 45, Middle East is producing only 5% of the total world oil output and production. We're producing a lot of it. other areas of the world. The Russians are as well, coming out of places in Mexico and South America, the other countries producing a lot of oil. So you can see that why the British are so concerned about it is the future of oil production is rather significant, but yet they're still pulling back. Okay, Iraq then begins to supply Soviet, U.S., and British armies with goods, equipment, and food. They like that. So you see the change that takes place. I didn't cover Iraq before, but here is a little bit, just got two left here for us. Rationing begins in Iraq in 1944, and the last one for today, 1945. The war ends. Iraq is faced with major opposition groups to what they've been doing from 39 to 43, supporting the Germans, and then 43 to 45. And now when the war ends, the British are going to take a movement out of the Middle East along with France, and as a result of it, you know who's going to come in. It's going to be the Soviets, and it's going to be the U.S. All right, so that's about, we lost a good 10, 12 minutes there trying to shift from one group to the next. So I'll pick up with the Suez Crisis next week and a little bit more on I'll get into the Arab-Israeli war for us. Then we'll try to get into what's happening in Iran, the Iranian Revolution. So it gives you a little bit of an overview. Thank you for staying and hanging in there. I don't know